When it comes to watercolor painting, the right paper can make all the difference. Today, we're putting two of the most popular watercolor papers to the test, Arches and Fabriano. Which one handles multiple washes better? Which one gives the smoothest blending? And which one is the best value for money? I'll be painting the same scene on both, so you can see how they compare in real time, and I'll also be giving some tips along the way on how to paint this simple, beginner-friendly landscape. A list of the materials used can be found in the description below, so let's get painting. The Fabriano paper is at top and Arches is below. And I'm starting on the Fabriano with a clear wash of water down to my pencil line at the bottom of the mountain range. Doing the same on the Arches paper. I'm using a number 12 round brush at this stage. Having completed that, I've got my weak wash of Winsor Blue, just creating a few gaps of blue in between the white cloud shapes. One observation I can make at this early stage is that the absorbency speed at the Arches paper is slightly quicker than the Fabriano. You'll notice with the Fabriano that the water and pigments stay on the surface that little bit longer. It's not marked in comparison, but it is slightly discernible. I have gone into the darker mixture of the Winsor Blue with a touch of the red. Then with a reasonably dry brush, I'm just mopping up here and there, mopping up some of the excess, and also using tissue, then a hairdryer. Then still with my number 12 brush, I'm laying clear water down on the mountain range on the Fabriano paper at the top, all the way down to the pencil line, and the same again with the Arches. Then I'm just laying down the weak blue mixture, starting at the top of the mountain range on both pieces of paper. Now you'll notice that I'm always dipping into the same well of pigment pre-prepared for each paper as I go along. Then I've gone to a number 6 brush and I've got the darker mixture and start at the top of the mountain range for Fabriano and work that way down a little, but let the pigment work for you as well in working its way down to the pencil line at the base of the mountain range. I want it slightly darker at the top of the range. As it goes down, it gets fainter. Now I need a much darker mixture for each of these two mountain ranges. So you can mix up the Winsor Blue and your red, slightly darker. Exactly the same for both. Once again, letting that fuse in to the bottom of the mountain range as much as possible. And you'll notice that with the Fabriano, I'm having to force that down a little bit into the bottom of the mountain range. Then dry that off with a hairdryer. Then I'm laying down some clear water in what will be the stream for the Fabriano paper at the top, and do the same again with Arches at the bottom. I'm using a flat brush, very small one, can be something like a quarter size, and then as I progress I can use a larger flat size, especially for the part of the stream that's closest to us at the bottom. Then whilst still wet, use that small flat brush to lay down some of the weak cobalt Winsor Blue mixture. And you'll see I'm trying to paint all the time in tandem so that we can get a good comparison of the two, rather than completely paint one painting and then go on to the other. So you can see the progression as we go along for each of the papers. Now both of those streams look about right. So nearest to me, I start with the darker mixture in the stream and slowly work my way up. I start at the bottom because that's where we want it strongest. And as I work my way up, it naturally becomes weaker. So the stream is lighter as it goes away from you, darker as it's near you. Then dry that off with the hairdryer again. I'm now mixing a version of the yellow, Winsor Yellow, which I'll be needing later. Now I've got my green mixture. This can be the Winsor Yellow and some Sap Green, because I want the distant trees to be fainter. And at this stage, they are very much an underpainting. They will receive on each of the two papers a darker mixture later. Using a number 6 brush, and as things progress, you'll see I can move to a smaller brush for more detail. You will notice, if you look very carefully, that the tooth of the paper, the little wells here and there for the rough paper, the wells are slightly larger in the Fabriano paper, and they're smaller in the arches and closer together by being smaller. This is something I'll come on to later when I talk about the scraping technique. So I go to a very small brush, something like a number 2, and start laying down some darker trees, starting with the Fabriano paper. I'm trying to give them as much character, varied shape as possible, and I've dipped into that darker mixture of the green. Still using the same colour mix-ins that we had at the beginning, just less water, more pigment. Nice and varied, good shaping, scraping as much as possible here and there. Now on the arches paper, the same sequence, same process, the darker mixture. Exactly from the same palette, so we have consistency on the strength of mixed pigment between one and the other. I wanted everything to be exactly the same in terms of the amount of pigment to water, etc., for both papers to get a true, honest comparison. When I do the scraping technique, it's more obvious at the base of the trees than the other parts of the trees. And you will notice as I progress that I get a slightly better variation for the scraping technique on the arches paper, but it is a small variation. Nothing is marked and a large variation. So then I've gone into the yellow, Winsor Yellow, and painting the landscape area, the fields that come up to the stream, doing the base both for each paper. Using a number 12 brush at this stage, come up to the edge of the stream on each occasion. Later on, we will be darkening the areas that meet the stream. So that's done. Then I've decided I'll start laying in some of the fainter distant trees. So that helps emphasize the distance of those trees as they regress into the background. And then also with that medium mixture, I'm just strengthening up a little bit some of the more distant trees. But you can see by the strength of colour that I have laid down that they are distinctly more distant. Continue with that. This is a fairly lengthy process because there's lots of small trees going into the distance in that middle ground area, and a very weak mixture to help me emphasize a distance and a regression. Once again, I will be careful to use the same mixture for each papers. Also, I would say I'm finding it slightly easier to do the scraping technique when laying down these trees on the arches paper. Once again, I would emphasize in everything I've said so far, there's not a major difference between the two. It is a subtle difference. I would say at this stage that both of these papers are cotton in terms of the method of manufacture. Both are acid free. Both are sized, which controls the absorbency of the pigment into the papers. The Arches is a gelatin size, and the Fabriano is a plant-based size. So using a number 2 brush for detail, emphasizing those more distant trees here and there. And there'll come a stage where those trees that are more immediate, those closest to us, can be darkened some more on both papers. Now I've gone to my flat brush with the yellow mixture on top of the underpainting of the yellow, laying that down with the small flat brush to start with. And then once I've done that, I can lay on some of the green mixture and let that fuse together. And that's just adding to the underpainting for each of the two paintings. And as you can see, they look very similar at this stage. Now I'm just strengthening up here and there some of the more immediate trees, using a number 6 brush, using the scraping technique as much as possible, which helps me achieve variation in the trees and more interesting shapes. That's quite a long process, and as I do this on the arches paper, I referred to the rough texture, basically the tooth of the paper, and you will see that as I scrape, I do get more variation. This is because the grain of the paper is such that it has a little bit more tooth to it than the Fabriano. Fabriano has tooth, but it's slightly smoother in the way it's constructed. As always, I can use the tissue here and there to dab if I've laid down too much pigment, too much water. And I would mention, because I mention it in other tutorials of mine, that I always have the paper at a slight angle sloping from the top to the bottom, something like 20 degrees, because I have a board at the top of the painting surface that I'm using, so the pigment can slowly run down and I can maintain control. And I'm emphasizing the areas of the landscape that meet the stream. So the parts that you can see, the underside, are darkened. Those parts that you can't see are left. Then you can just add some ripples here and there in the water of each one if you wish, but not all the way up. Just do those closest to you and leave the rest. And also use that scraping technique. You can use a combination of blue and the darker mixture of the blue for variation. Then you can use your flat brush to add a little bit more of the grasses using the scraping technique. Side of the brush fairly flat to the paper and scraped up. Then for added interest and a little bit of movement in the painting, I'm just adding a few birds in the sky there. I either do 3 or 5. Let's do 5. And use my small number 2 brush with a reasonably dark mixture on this occasion. Here are some conclusions I have reached when comparing the Fabriano paper with the Arches paper. I found that the Fabriano paper just needs a little bit more work in achieving the absorbency of your mixed paints into the paper, so it stays on the surface just slightly longer. It's not a big difference, but it's noticeable to me after 40 years of experience in painting transparent watercolors. With respect to the fact that they both have a rough grain, so the scraping technique is important to me, which I use quite often. I have found that it's slightly easier to achieve the scraping technique on the Arches paper. In terms of blending, Fabriano, I would recommend that once you have become more competent with your transparent watercolor paper, that maybe you could then go on to the Fabriano. It is a slightly cheaper paper by a few dollars for each large sheet of 22 inches by 30 inches. I think if you start with the Arches paper, it will help you a little bit more in making progress and achieving competence in watercolor paper. But as you've achieved that competence, then you will be able to use something like the Fabriano paper to produce your masterpieces, because you have already gained that experience and you will be able to cope with the differences that are involved in the two papers. I hope you have found that very useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.